Fox 13 News at 6 starts with breaking news. Take a look at this picture. In a story that you will only see on Fox 13, this is a convicted killer. Right now, he is on the run after the Shelby County Jail released him.
Now, this was a sudden change for Anthony Green. A jury convicted him of murder, and only 38 minutes later, the jail set him free.
Fox 13's Troyce Grant joins us live downtown at 201. Troyce, Fox 13 learned that this wasn't really an issue of just bad timing. Walk us through what happened.
Yes, so Anthony Green was here in jail at 201 Poplar.
Pooh Shiesty is reportedly under investigation for allegedly helping one of his closest associates escape from custody. And this is not just any associate. The individual at the center of this situation is a convicted murderer. Someone who was found guilty by a full jury and then somehow walked out of jail just 38 minutes later. 38 minutes. A verdict was read, first-degree murder was confirmed, and before the reality of that decision could even settle in the room, this man was already gone. He exited the system like the process barely applied to him at all. Now, federal authorities believe Pooh Shiesty may have played a role in helping him stay hidden in the aftermath. As investigators try to understand how something like this could happen without assistance from the outside. It sounds like the plot of a crime thriller, but this is unfolding in real time, right now, in Memphis. The timeline alone raises uncomfortable questions, and the implications stretch far beyond one escape. Before getting into how Pooh Shiesty allegedly became connected to this situation, it's important to slow everything down and look closely at who this escaped individual really is. His name is Anthony Green, but on the streets he's known as Chopawop, a name that carries weight in certain Memphis circles. Chopawop is not some unknown figure or random associate. He is deeply connected to the same Memphis network that Pooh Shiesty comes from, a circle that overlaps with the broader 1017 movement that helped launch Pooh's career. In Memphis, those connections matter. The city's street structure is tight, personal, and heavily relationship-based. Everyone knows everyone, and loyalty is not just expected, it's enforced by circumstance. To understand why this case feels so serious to investigators, you have to understand how Memphis street culture operates. Unlike cities where crews are spread out or loosely connected, Memphis, especially areas like South Memphis and Whitehaven, functions almost like a closed system. Relationships are built early, often before any money or fame is involved, and those bonds tend to last. Pooh Shiesty came up in this environment, grinding from nothing, surrounded by the same faces he still keeps around today. Fame didn't change who was considered family. It just changed the scale of the consequences. Chopawop was one of those original figures. Long before the record deals, long before the spotlight, even before the 1017 Records connection with Gucci Mane, these were people moving together in the same spaces, dealing with the same pressures. That kind of shared history creates a loyalty that doesn't disappear when circumstances turn dangerous. It's the type of bond where people convince themselves that protecting one person is worth risking everything else. To understand how this all spiraled into a federal investigation, you have to go back to where it started. June of 2020, Whitehaven, Memphis. A summer night where the air was heavy and the streets were active. A 27-year-old man named Octavius Atkins was sitting in his car at the intersection of Shelby Drive and Neely Road. There's nothing in the reports to suggest he was doing anything unusual. He was simply there, in his vehicle, likely waiting or passing time like countless others have done in that same spot. Then, without warning, a white Mercedes SUV pulled up. According to police reports and witness statements, shots rang out almost immediately. Multiple rounds were fired into Atkins' vehicle. There was no prolonged argument, no visible hesitation. The shooting was fast, deliberate, and final. Octavius Atkins was killed right there at the scene. His life ended in seconds before help could arrive or questions could be answered. The violence didn't stop with him. A 49-year-old man sitting in another nearby vehicle was also struck by gunfire. He survived, but the message was already sent. This was not a reckless accident. It was targeted, and it carried intent. Whoever was responsible had no concern for witnesses or consequences in that moment. After the shooting, the white Mercedes SUV disappeared. It left the area as quickly as it arrived, vanishing into the Memphis streets. Law enforcement immediately began working the case, knowing the speed and confidence of the attack suggested planning. From the very beginning, this wasn't treated as a random act. It was approached as something more organized, something connected, and something that would eventually lead much higher than the crime scene itself. Hours after the shooting, investigators located that same white Mercedes SUV abandoned behind a building, completely burned out. The vehicle had been deliberately set on fire. This was not accidental damage or panic-driven destruction. Someone took the time to torch the car, clearly attempting to erase any trace of evidence tied to it. That decision alone told detectives this was not a random act of violence. It pointed to planning, awareness, and an understanding of how criminal investigations unfold. Whoever was involved knew exactly what they were trying to eliminate. By burning the vehicle, they were trying to destroy DNA, fingerprints, ballistic residue, and anything else that could connect the crime to a specific person. Memphis police immediately recognized they were dealing with someone who understood how evidence works and how cases are built. This was not sloppy. This was intentional. From that moment, the investigation took on a different tone, because the effort to cover tracks suggested deeper connections and experience. The Memphis Police Department spent months working the case. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses and intersections, interviewed witnesses, reconstructed timelines, and followed every lead they could verify. Slowly, piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Eventually, investigators identified their primary suspect, Anthony Green, also known as Chopawop. Once enough evidence was assembled, a warrant was issued for his arrest. Not long after, a Mississippi Highway Patrol officer located him during a traffic stop and took him into custody. Chopawop was arrested and formally charged with first-degree murder for the killing of Octavius Atkins. At that point, the case seemed straightforward. He was held in jail awaiting trial, facing the most serious charge possible under Tennessee law. But while he was sitting behind bars waiting for that murder trial, another detail entered the picture, and it would later become critically important. Chopawop also had a separate theft charge pending against him. Compared to murder, it was minor, but it created a legal complication that would eventually expose a massive failure inside the system. He was granted bond on the theft charge while still incarcerated on the murder charge. That meant he technically posted bail for the lesser offense, even though he remained locked up because of the homicide case. On paper, the system treated those charges separately, and that separation would later prove disastrous. At the time, it didn't raise alarms. It was just another procedural detail buried in court records. Then, on September 24, 2025, Chopawop's murder trial finally went forward. 5 years after the killing, he stood in front of a jury. They were shown the full scope of the evidence. Surveillance footage placing him at the scene. Witness statements describing the events. Forensic analysis connected to the burned Mercedes. Prosecutors carefully laid out the sequence, demonstrating how the shooting unfolded, how evidence was destroyed afterward, and how one man lost his life while another was wounded simply for being nearby. The case was methodical. Each piece of evidence reinforced the next. By the time closing arguments ended, the narrative was clear. The jury deliberated and returned with a verdict that carried permanent consequences. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder under Tennessee law. A conviction that carries a mandatory life sentence, no discretion, no early release, no reduced term. Life in prison. Everyone in that courtroom understood what that verdict meant. Prosecutors expected immediate processing. The judge expected the defendant to be remanded into custody. The victim's family likely felt a sense of closure after years of waiting, believing justice had finally caught up. In their minds, this was the end of a long and painful chapter. But what happened next is where the case stops making sense. Because after the guilty verdict was read, Chopawop was supposed to be taken back into custody immediately. His bonds should have been revoked. His status should have changed from defendant to convicted murderer serving a life sentence. That paperwork should have been processed without delay. Instead, something went wrong, and that failure would allow a convicted killer to walk free. The court clerk should have immediately updated the system, transmitted the conviction paperwork to the jail, and ensured that every department involved understood one thing clearly. This man was no longer eligible for release under any circumstance. But somewhere between the courtroom and the jail intake system, a serious failure occurred. Not a minor delay. A critical breakdown. At 201 Poplar, the main jail facility in Memphis, the paperwork that arrived told an incomplete story. When Chapawap's information was reviewed by jail staff, the only records visible in the system showed that he had posted bond on a theft charge. The documents reflecting his fresh conviction for first-degree murder, the ruling that should have revoked every bond and changed his status permanently, had not been processed yet. Those papers were not in the system. Whether they were sitting on a desk, buried in a backlog, or stalled somewhere in administrative limbo, the result was the same. In the jail system, if it isn't entered, it doesn't exist. Based on what the computer showed, jail officials followed procedure. They released him. A man convicted of first-degree murder walked out of custody just 38 minutes after a jury found him guilty. 38 minutes. Less time than it takes most people to clear intake on a minor charge. Chapawap stepped back onto the streets of Memphis as a free man. His attorney Brandon Hall later confirmed the sequence publicly. Speaking to Fox 13, Hall explained that the release was the result of a clerical error, a paperwork failure. He pointed out something that made the situation even harder to explain. In his experience, the jail system is notoriously slow. He regularly sees clients who post bond on low-level charges sit in intake for days before being released. 48 hours is common. Delays are expected. Yet in this one instance, the system worked with rare speed, efficient, immediate, just long enough to release a convicted murderer. The mistake wasn't discovered until the following day, September 25th, 2025. That's when someone finally processed the conviction paperwork and realized what had happened. Alarms were raised immediately. Authorities moved quickly to contain the damage. A new warrant was issued for Anthony Green, charging him again with first-degree murder, employing a firearm during the commission of a felony, and criminal attempted first-degree murder related to the 49-year-old man who survived the shooting. But by then it was too late. Chapawap was gone. He had nearly a full 24-hour head start. Enough time to leave the city, cross state lines, and disappear into places where tracking him would be difficult. Safe houses, rural areas, networks that don't ask questions. The window created by that single error changed everything. This is where another name began circulating quietly, Pooh Shiesty, according to Street Talk, and what investigators are reportedly examining. Authorities believe he may have helped Chapawap stay hidden after the release. At first glance, that raises obvious questions. Pooh Shiesty is currently incarcerated himself, serving time on federal charges connected to a separate case in Miami. On the surface, it doesn't make sense. But loyalty in these circles doesn't stop at prison walls. Investigators are allegedly looking into whether resources were moved, money was sent, and connections were activated from the inside. The kind of assistance that doesn't require physical presence. Just access, trust, and the right people on the outside. If true, it suggests that even behind bars, influence can still reach far beyond the cell. Investigators believe what is happening next follows a pattern they've seen before in organized fugitive cases, and none of it appears accidental. First, there's the issue of money. Chapawap cannot stay on the run without consistent financial support. Living as a fugitive is expensive. Food, transportation, temporary places to stay, changing locations frequently, replacing clothing to avoid recognition, and compensating people for their silence all require cash. Survival on the run depends on steady funding, not one-time help. According to Street Chatter and what investigators are reportedly examining, Pooh Shiesty is believed to be facilitating that financial flow. The suspicion is that money is being funneled through indirect channels, not sent openly or in a way that immediately raises red flags. Family members, trusted associates, and mutual connections within their circle are allegedly being used as intermediaries. The amounts being discussed are not minor. Investigators believe the funds involved are significant enough to allow Chapawap to remain comfortable while actively evading a murder warrant. The suspected method behind this money movement is not simple or careless. Even while incarcerated, Pooh Shiesty still has access to income streams. Music royalties continue to come in. Business interests remain active. Accounts are often managed by teams, lawyers, or trusted individuals. What investigators believe may be happening is that instructions are being passed to people on the outside, directing how funds should move without creating a clean trail. Money may be split into smaller amounts, moved through multiple people. or sent using platforms and accounts that don't directly connect back to the final recipient. This kind of process is known for making financial trails difficult to follow. Cash transfers may be broken up. Digital payments may move through layers of accounts. In some cases, physical cash is passed hand to hand, creating gaps that paperwork cannot easily bridge. While federal investigators are skilled at tracking money, this type of structuring complicates the process and slows everything down, especially when loyalty keeps people silent. The second major element investigators are focused on is shelter. A fugitive cannot stay in random locations and expect to remain hidden for long. Safe houses are essential. These are places where questions aren't asked and where loyalty outweighs fear of consequences. Authorities believe Chapa Wap has been connected to such locations through an existing network tied to Memphis and surrounding areas. These locations are believed to include properties owned or controlled by individuals with long-standing loyalty to the same circle. Some may be trap houses, others rental properties secured under names that don't draw attention. And some may be private residences belonging to people far enough removed that law enforcement wouldn't immediately think to look there. These are not temporary crash spots. They're controlled environments designed to keep someone off the radar. The third piece involves resources. Staying hidden requires more than just money and a roof. Investigators believe Chapa Wap has access to burner phones, alternative identification, and transportation that cannot be traced back to him. Using a personal phone would immediately expose location data. Driving a vehicle registered in his name would trigger alerts in law enforcement databases nationwide. None of that is an option. Instead, authorities believe he's cycling through disposable phones, using them briefly before discarding them. Vehicles are believed to be supplied through other people, registered under unrelated names, and swapped frequently. Movement is controlled, planned, and quiet. Each step is designed to reduce exposure. Investigators suspect these resources are being coordinated through established connections, not randomly acquired. This is where the structure of the Memphis street network becomes critical. The same tight-knit environment that builds loyalty also creates infrastructure. People know who to call, they know where to move, they know who can help without talking. Investigators believe that network is being used now, not impulsively, but deliberately, to keep Chapa Wap one step ahead while authorities try to close the gap. Pooh Shiesty is known to have connections across neighborhoods, area codes, and entire regions. His reach doesn't stop at Memphis city limits. Investigators believe his network stretches through Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, and deeper into the South. Even from inside federal custody, a few phone calls are enough to activate that network. Authorities suspect this influence could be used to move Chapa Wap from location to location, never staying in one place too long, always remaining just ahead of law enforcement pressure. The structure resembles an informal underground system built on trust, familiarity, and long-standing relationships. The question investigators are focused on is how they even began to suspect Pooh Shiesty's involvement in the first place. Part of the answer lies in surveillance. In federal custody, nothing is private. Phone calls are recorded, mail is reviewed, visits are monitored, every interaction is logged and analyzed. If someone is coordinating activity from inside, patterns eventually emerge. Investigators listen for coded language, repeated contacts, changes in communication behavior, and subtle shifts that indicate something is being organized behind the scenes. Even when nothing explicitly incriminating is said, experienced investigators are trained to read between the lines. Timing matters. Who is being contacted matters. What happens shortly after those calls matters. When authorities compare communication records with sightings of Chapa Wap, financial movements, and the involvement of certain individuals, overlaps begin to form. According to sources familiar with the investigation, many of those overlaps allegedly point back to people connected to Pooh Shiesty. Financial records are being examined closely. Phone records are being cross-referenced. Surveillance footage from locations where Chapa Wap may have passed through is being reviewed. Investigators are also applying pressure where it's most effective. Low-level associates are being questioned. People who may have unknowingly crossed a legal line are being confronted with their exposure. Cooperation becomes a conversation when consequences feel real. Memphis is a tight-knit environment, but no network is completely sealed. Someone always knows something. And when federal pressure increases, silence becomes harder to maintain. A traffic stop involving unexplained cash can quickly turn into a money laundering inquiry. Letting someone stay for a short period can become a harboring charge. When people realize their own freedom is at risk, loyalty is tested. Everyone involved understands the history between Chapawap and Pooh Shiesty. They come from the same circles. They share the same connections. In that world, helping your people is expected. Turning your back is seen as betrayal. The code prioritizes loyalty above legality, even when the cost is high. Pooh Shiesty built much of his public image around that code. In his music and interviews before his incarceration, he consistently emphasized standing by his people, never switching sides, and staying solid regardless of pressure. Now, investigators believe that same mindset may be guiding his actions from behind bars. If the allegations are accurate, it suggests he is continuing to live by that code, even when it could add years to his sentence. But federal authorities see it differently. Helping a fugitive evade capture is not a minor offense. It carries serious consequences. These are federal charges that extend beyond loyalty, beyond reputation, and into long-term legal fallout that compounds everything already at stake. Conspiracy to harbor a fugitive, obstruction of justice, potentially even aiding and abetting. If investigators can prove that money and resources were intentionally provided to help Chapawap evade capture, if that connection is established, the consequences are severe. Pooh Shiesty is already serving time related to gun charges stemming from the Miami case, facing a 5-year sentence. Additional federal charges tied to this situation could extend that sentence significantly. This does not stop with him. Anyone who allegedly helped Chapawap along the way could also be exposed. Family members, friends, associates, anyone who provided transportation, shelter, or financial assistance. Harboring a fugitive, especially one convicted of first-degree murder, is treated aggressively at the federal level. The scope of this investigation is not limited to 1 or 2 individuals. It expands outward, following the support structure that allowed a convicted killer to remain free. As of now, Chapawap remains on the run. Memphis police continue searching, applying pressure where they can, revisiting known locations, and monitoring people believed to be connected to him. His image has been circulated widely, appearing on Crime Stoppers listings, local news segments, and law enforcement bulletins. Rewards have been offered for information leading to his capture. Despite all of that, he has managed to stay hidden for months. That fact alone tells investigators something important. Avoiding capture for this long does not happen by accident. Not in an era where cameras are everywhere, where license plates are tracked, where facial recognition exists, and where one mistake can end everything. Staying free requires planning, coordination, and help. It points to an organized support system working quietly in the background. Stepping back, the implications of this case go far beyond one escape or one rapper's alleged involvement. This situation exposes a failure at multiple levels of the system. A man convicted of first-degree murder should never be able to walk out of custody because of a paperwork error. The safeguards are supposed to prevent exactly this. Yet in 2025, with all the technology and oversight in place, a life sentence was handed down and effectively ignored for nearly an hour. That failure put an entire community at risk. Chapawap was convicted of killing one man and seriously injuring another. While he remains at large, the threat is real. The question is not hypothetical. If he feels cornered or threatened, the potential for further violence exists. The consequences of that original mistake continue to ripple outward. For the victim's family, the impact is devastating. After 5 years of waiting, they believed justice had finally been served. Instead, they were forced to confront the reality that the person responsible for their loss was free. Knowing that someone convicted of murdering your loved one is walking the streets creates constant fear. It removes any sense of closure and replaces it with uncertainty and trauma. Then there's the question of loyalty. In the world these individuals come from, loyalty is treated as an absolute. When someone from your circle is in trouble, you respond. You do not ask questions. You do not hesitate. But this case forces a deeper consideration. At what point does loyalty cross into something far more dangerous? At what point does it become participation in harm? If the allegations are true, Pooh Shiesty would be risking years, possibly decades of additional prison time to help a convicted murderer remain free. That level of loyalty carries consequences not just for those involved, but for innocent people who could be affected by what follows. It also raises the question of sacrifice. Giving up a future for someone else, while already incarcerated, changes the trajectory of every life connected to the decision. At the center of all of this is Octavius Atkins, a 27-year-old man who lost his life at an intersection in Whitehaven, someone who had plans, relationships, and people who cared about him. Another individual was injured that same night simply for being nearby. These are not abstract details. These are real lives permanently altered by violence and by a system that failed to contain its outcome. And now, because of a clerical failure, and allegedly because of help from people connected to this network, the man responsible is walking free instead of serving a mandatory life sentence. That is not justice for the victims. It is not safety for the community. But it does reflect a reality that exists in certain environments, where loyalty is sometimes treated as more binding than the law itself, and where the code carries more weight than consequences. This is not about defending or condemning it. It's about recognizing how that mindset operates and how it continues to shape decisions long after the courtroom clears. This is the world Pooh Shiesty and Chapawap come from, and according to investigators, it's the same world they are still operating within, even now. One from behind bars, the other while actively on the run. The structures don't disappear just because circumstances change. They adapt, they shift, they keep moving. So where does this leave things now? The investigation is ongoing. Federal agents and Memphis police are actively working to locate Chapawap and to identify everyone who may have helped him remain free. Time, resources, and pressure are all being applied simultaneously. Communication records are being reviewed. Financial movements are being examined. Associations are being mapped. Every connection matters. Pooh Shiesty's name continues to surface in those efforts, and if investigators are able to assemble a complete and provable picture, additional charges could follow. Every phone call from inside federal custody is being scrutinized. Every relationship is being re-examined. Nothing is being overlooked. The perimeter is tightening, and history shows that when that happens, something eventually gives. And when Chapawap is caught, because cases like this do not remain unresolved forever, the focus will not stop with him. Everyone who played a role in helping him stay free will face consequences. That is how federal cases work. The objective is not just to apprehend the fugitive, but to dismantle the support system that made the escape sustainable. Arrests create leverage. Leverage creates cooperation. Cooperation exposes the full scope. That is when the truth becomes clearer. That is when investigators determine who helped, how they helped, and how far the involvement really went. Until then, what remains is a case that feels unreal, but is grounded in documented failures, real losses, and very real risks. A convicted murderer walking out of jail in under an hour. An entire system exposed by a single error. Allegations of coordination from behind prison walls. These are not theories pulled from fiction. They are developments unfolding in real time, with consequences that extend far beyond the individuals involved. This case stands as a reminder of how fragile the balance can be when systems fail and loyalties collide with accountability. It shows how quickly things can spiral when safeguards break down, and how difficult it becomes to restore order once that line is crossed. The story is still developing, and the final outcomes have yet to be written. But one thing is already clear. This situation did not end the moment a verdict was read. In many ways, that was only the beginning.